have their own style, I figured out.
Yeah, I just want to create a product that
the first three are going to be done by one group, and then the last three, so the first four questions, 1, 1A, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 5A will be done by a different group. And we are going to cover this in principle. It also deals with a key question that was asked by email by a couple of people. When we say what, I mean, is there anything from the last lecture, maybe it was a very specific question, but more broadly, what I mean by what is their best plan going forward, I mean to touch on some of these things. So we're going to cover marketing, we're going to cover expats, which I think is a really important topic. So I would suggest it is important, it is required almost to at least make a comment about definitely expatriate levels, what you think their role will be in your case, as well as what do you think the marketing should be. Clearly the make or buy or physical distribution questions are much less, impertinent. And so, I agree that that would be a very lightly covered, unless you have something very specific to say. You don't need to please me. I'm not looking for you to comment on distribution when it's a services business, to the extent it doesn't need to be said. So these are the questions for the end. And why I'm showing you now is if you jot them down or screenshot it, as we go through it, you'll be able to kind of prepare. Then we will have a little break, so you can just touch up the notes. Splitting this into two groups, and hopefully that would be a kind of really neat way of getting through all the material plus doing this. All right, so on to the content. So firstly, a quick review, and just really there were two big topics, that were kind of notable. One was this bullwhip effect, and we tried to play the bullwhip game, which which, on a Zoom call, proved more sort of technically challenging than expected. Nonetheless, we made the comment that what actually happens here, as some people experienced, is when there is a variance in the demand. So I said it's about 100 is your units in stock. And if you recall, I did 100 with an Excel randomizer to give me up to 200 or down to 0, some sort of demand. Whenever the retailer sees a little bit too much demand, what they tend to do is they say to the distributor, I need a bit more stock. But if this is plus 20, so 120, so it's over by 20, then they might say to the distributor, please order 140 units for me. And the distributor sees this and they say, whoa, please order 160 units for me. And by the time you get to a supplier, you're at, please order 200. And in fact, one of the groups had eventually an order of over just 10 rounds of several hundred going up and down. And that's kind of the key challenge that we mentioned on the bullwhip. And we said that, what fixes this or what avoids it is better information flow up and down the chain, because then everybody would be able to moderate their volumes and you don't have this kind of escalation. And then we spoke about make or buy. And we said that when you make it, when you're fully integrated, you get better quality and lower costs. It can be done. Specialized investments, because effectively you take on all the risk. And so a supplier isn't kind of hedging their bets. You obviously protect your proprietary technology really well, and your scheduling and integration can be perfect. And on the reverse side, it is a less flexible system. It can lead to poor levels of competition and inefficiency and low levels of specialization. So you can be subscale in pieces of your business. So when you produce a Boeing aeroplane, you might not be scale for producing landing gear, although you are scale for producing aircraft. So this was just a key, again, perhaps not particularly relevant for your case. This is going to be pretty relevant. Just as a very overview, and not this slide in particular, but I'd suggest whenever you move into a market, the volume, getting some pricing information is important. So 20th percentile, what's the median average price, 80th percentile price point. Some of the things we saw with Persia, India is extremely low price pointing. In fact, produce a new vehicle. You see that also with Renault produces some vehicles there. Very, very low price points. So it's quite important that these numbers are clear. We had a bit of a debate in the class about could the ambassador brand be used? And I suppose only time will tell. But the reality is there were good arguments presented for or against. You can use an electric vehicles that might be just 1% of the market. It's a big market, so maybe that's okay. But it is important to have a look at this. Other groups saying better effort could be in two-wheelers because that's where there's a lot of volume. What are the top 5 brands? Because their distribution, their network size, how much they localize is likely to give you really good insights into what the market is looking for. It would be a little unusual if you say, for example, we sell cars, we sell Persia, we're going to embark on a completely novel strategy that nobody else has tried. Typically, you don't make money, and unless you're Tesla, you usually don't get rewarded by the stock market. So, there's always an anomaly, but typically people want you to produce some returns. And what is your brand share and average price point? Because if you know what the average brands and their price points are, it's a little more granular. So, I think that whenever there's a market demand analysis, it's important. And really what the slide says is how big is your market? What price are you going to sell it? What are your competitors doing? If you knew nothing else and you got these 3 questions right, you probably wouldn't make a complete hash of an entry decision. Okay, so just in class, what are the 7 Ps of marketing?
Product, price,
place.
product,
Yeah, good.
Decision.
Yeah, I think.
People process?
Sorry?
People process?
Yes, people, process.
P. I think we have, what else?
Promotion.
Oh, yeah.
Promotion is a good one. And last one, So we've got the 4 Ps. This is where it started, and we've got that idea of placement or position. I think, Monica, if you meant it in the physical sense. So what are you selling your stuff for? What is it? How are you promoting it? And where are you trying to sell it through? We're going to delve into some of these in a little more detail. And then the next 3 are much more orientated around service industries, which should ring a bell about Orphea. So physical evidence, which is, can you sell a Chanel bag for $10,000 US in a supermarket with next to groceries? You know, so there's some obvious sort of things that you go, there's physical evidence that helps to convince the consumer that it's a rational decision to pay exorbitant amounts of money for some products. And then obviously for services, if you are offering a high-end accounting service, legal service, you tend to, be on the 10th floor of some multi-story overlooking the bay. And this provides some sort of tangibility to a service. So there's the next 3 are much more heavily focused in terms of services and should be considered. The first 4 were much more product oriented. They still apply to services, but what I'm saying is the weight. Last 3 very service oriented, a bit product. First 4 very product and a bit service. So obviously process is just how does the actual value get delivered? Is that efficient? Is it neat? Is the customer experience good? And people, which is actually who are my people and how do I select them so that I am monitoring their customer interface at all times. So, one of the things we're going to talk in just a second about is consistency, and that's quite important here.
Is that where customer segmentation comes in, Nicholas?
Under people or?
Yes.
No, I would say customer segmentation is something that you probably do. I would suggest first it's defining an archetypal customer. So this is very, very practical, but so first you would go, I've got 3 or 4 different types of customer. What do they look like? Just so that you can help anchor the discussion. So one customer, for example, is in the pharmaceuticals world, you'll go, I have a 70-year-old male who has multiple conditions, including high blood pressure and type 2 diabetes. They have polypharmacy. They're on 20 different drugs. My next consumer is a family for their young child where it's colds and flu. So the point is you create some consumers, and then those consumers, you can customize the 7 Ps for them to some extent. Now, clearly you can't have completely different Ps for all of it, but it gives you a sense of maybe the product is different for them. So with pharmaceuticals, a little more challenging, but for motor vehicles, the product is different for a 20-year-old versus a midlife person versus a retiree. But your dealership, your physical evidence is always the same. So these, you can't simply go, well, all 7 Ps get customized because some of them are brand issues. Physical evidence, process, people, I would suggest are brands. Whereas price, product, promotion is quite more product oriented, and placement depends on your distribution channel. So let's just think about that. Like if we said Chanel or Gucci or YSL or something like that, I would argue that your physical evidence, your store, which is on on a main street, is going to be consistent. The physical evidence on my purchase, the process, the kind of hand holding, the high levels of customer service, the way my people are dressed, who I'm hiring, that's going to be consistent, even though my product range may be from $1,000 to $100,000.
Okay.
And I think that those 3 tend to be brand clustered. So back to your question, or just to summarize, when you segment a market, you're going, what do my different customers look like? And what product or service do they want to buy? At what price point, with what features and specifications, and how do I promote to them? When it comes to the physical evidence, process, and people, often it can't be disentangled from your brand because it's difficult to replicate them every time. Have a different physical evidence. In fact, I would suggest it's theoretically almost impossible and probably quite damaging.
Thank you.
So let's not break out just so that we can make sure we've got sufficient time. And so some of these I would suggest are more sensitive to cage distance. And so I'm just going to ask a few questions just for some call outs. Price, what is price most sensitive to,
The economic distance?
Yeah, I'd suggest the bigger economic distance, the more likely price. We just saw Persia US, where we argued that US customers may be tolerant of higher product specs, lower, higher pricing, and vice versa for India. So price and product. Product, what's a kind of key one for product?
Cultural?
Yeah, absolutely. So your use cases for beer are going to be sensitive to this. Your vehicle specifications are going to be sensitive to this. Clearly, if you're producing music or something, that's very sensitive. If we look at perhaps physical evidence is going to be what?
It's got to be around geographic.
Maybe. Look, I think physical evidence is more about, think of it as your store fit out, your shop front fit out. I say shop front in a broad way. Not only is it the Chanel shop, how does it look, what quality tiles, what do we do? But it could be, if you're KPMG, what do our offices need to look like? So that is physical.
Oh, it's culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's, again, likely to be culture, also likely to be economics. If you're going to charge a huge number, then your store needs to look a particular way. And if you are attracting mass market, that same thing is going to be difficult to monetize. And so you end up with something, this is not definitive, but something that looks like cultural is important, less so for price, but it is important for promotions, products, placement. I once, we had, in the auto world, they often bring you together like annually to share experiences across countries. And there are some really specific things that are inappropriately presented. So we once had a talk by Tunisia on how to sell more trucks that involved following the camel trains, and setting up tents in the desert, just completely irrelevant for 99.9% of other countries. Just, there's a real difference there. Processes, as we said, administrative in banking and healthcare is an important cage distance. And so process, physical evidence, and people may be affected in all three if you're in a highly regulated environment. What are you allowed to do? What are the requirements? These are the kinds of questions you would be facing if you were internationalizing or FIA. You go, okay, am I just allowed to do what I want with people? Yeah. All right, communication channels. So you clearly have direct selling, sales promotion, direct marketing, and advertising, which is of many different types. And so a communication strategy, we're going to touch back on this when we come to push versus pull strategies. But just to have that vocabulary kind of there, what direct sales promotion. Advertising is really reaching out to customers where they are outside of a sales moment. That's kind of more pure marketing. Direct marketing is marketing material, but it's far more targeted. And then sales promotion and direct selling would be at the moment of truth, they call it. How do you affect the decision making? So that's much more sales oriented. We don't have time. This is not a marketing course to go through this. I'm more than happy if you email me a question. Okay, I included this, and I included the reading because I think that at any level, if you are overseeing an internationalization strategy, it's important to kind of make a decision about your product or service. And Percy and Rossiter have this kind of very useful and theoretically and academically valid model. So they say there's two types of products broadly: informational, which is that the buying motivation is some sort of negative problem removal, and transformation, where it's a really positive emotion. Now, it's not meant to kind of twist your mind around what what exactly fits into each category. But it is important to kind of just think of a product as, am I selling it as something that's going to really up and change your life? Or am I selling it as something that will deal with challenges that you have? Because you've got things like Sandy Putzmeister that we're going to cover later. And so you want to think about what sort of product is their equipment. Just broadly, where does it fit into this category? And then you've got high involvement and low involvement. And effectively, that's a dimension around, how much risk is there involved in each purchase. And the importance here is simply about how do you approach the market? What is your messaging? What does your advertising look like? And so you don't need to know enormous amounts about an industry or a product, but categorizing it here will allow you to always ask the right questions and oversee a marketing effort. And that's my goal here, is that, you can say, hey, I believe that our product is this, and I need to see the following in the marketing plan. Did we deal with it or not? If you didn't deal with it, then this is a valid sort of model. All right, so what we've got from that, and as you can see, you've got this kind of 2x2. So you've got this informational transformational dimension, and you've got a low involvement, high involvement dimension. And what that is about is just about being aware of your product and what it needs. And you just need to note what is the correct emotional appeal, and have I made adequate logical support for the two. So Orphea, what is that? Give some comments with some justification. I'm not going to write this down so you can change your mind, but it's useful to consider. What is the nursing business? And why I think it's a good discussion here is, one, it doesn't matter if you give an incorrect answer now, as long as you think about your answer. And two is, the point is this model can be applied to any product. Okay, well, let me give a prompter question. Deal with them separately. Do you believe that placing your elderly, presumably loved one, but let's not stretch it, somebody who's old that you're making a decision like this on behalf of, is low involvement? In other words, try and if it works out, cool, and if it doesn't work out, well, no problem, you'll move on. Or is it going to be high involvement? In other words, it's a decision that is quite important. You would ask for quite a lot of research to get right first time.
I think I would go with high involvement.
Yeah.
Anybody dissent? No, I mean, I tend to agree, right? I think that, this is a type of thing which tends to be higher involvement, there's no doubt.
Yep.
And then out of these, so we've now kind of gone, great, that's our zone, great. And there might be more nuances, you may end up with a bit in each, but what's the thoughts? Is it negative drive reduction or positive drive enhancement?
See, I was just going kind of just to throw in the middle there somehow, because I feel like, yes, it's informational in terms of there's possibly some problems to be solved. We need the housing, we might need the care facilities to support certain medical conditions, but at the same time, I don't know, like there's a certain drive of positivity for enhancement as well in certain brands, depending on the kind of care home you might place somebody in, because I think care homes go from a varying a premium to low income kind of options.
Yep. Any other comments?
I think it's more than information to me. It will be more transformation of the lifestyle change.
Right, so you're going maybe more here. Yeah, so look, I mean, I tend to agree. Paul says, well, there's different segments in this market. So if you were quite low end, just cost. I mean, there are old people who didn't end up with great retirement packages, right? So this is not a negative statement about them, but arguably they might be looking for safety, reliability, and simply an ability to get by. And so you would suggest that that brand may sit right there in informational. On the other hand, you could retire to Mar-a-Lago, which is where Donald Trump is, and for some people that's transformational, right? They go, well, it's you know, I mean, it's a very different perspective. You know, what am I going to get out of this? Because clearly I have enough money to worry about those other things. And this would apply to, if you're selling Mercedes-Benz, you tend to be more over here. And if you're selling, you know, entry-level vehicles, you tend to be more on informational. One of the key things to note is if a product has a reasonable transformational element, it's important to not ignore it. You know, you won't see, and all of you have consumed television, I'm sure, before the internet. And you wouldn't have seen any car adverts which completely avoided the transformational element. And so I would suggest it's exactly the same when you're talking about old age homes, in that even if you're selling an entry-level product, you know, people want to have that feeling that there's some positive element to it. So I would agree, you know, again, that it's always going to have an aspect of. But yeah, this is the kind of, this is what the model is used for, and it's part of your question for Sani and Putzmeister. So, you know, it's quite, but it sort of helps with an idea of how do I market to these people? What do I need to put in the messaging to them? If you have a high involvement product, people are going to look for information. So it's not a point of sale purchase. It's going to be deeply considered, you know, and there's going to be more contact time required in your sale. How you deal with that is tactical. We come on to this idea of brand knowledge. Okay, so now we've said that products can fit into types, and that type drives how we advertise. It also drives how we sell. And what we're trying to do is build brand equity through our advertising strategy, and that has really this component of brand awareness. And awareness has got one of two types. Again, you classify a product. It's important that you think of a product as having either a high recognition requirement or a high recall requirement. And I'd suggest you should be quite disciplined in not imagining that every product requires both, because it's a little bit sloppy to think that, and it certainly doesn't force you to really consider the fundamental sales process. So let's just I'd like some examples, please.
I gave one in the curator. For me, like recall is like a lunchtime F&B system. Like I'm thinking about what I might like in that moment and recalling the kind of product or brand I want to engage with.
That's right. So give us some examples of a recall product.
So it could be on a bad day, it's a fast food choice. So McDonald's or Subway or KFC. Okay.
I'm going to just call out some names so that we press on. Gio, just because you're next on my picture.
Yeah, so for
recall or recognition, just pick one.
Yeah, recall product. So like when we look at a high apparel brand,
Yep.
So for example, like the Gucci launched a new, I mean, kind of a recall model, which is a Jackie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
so I mean, I agree with that. Cool. May?
What about those car recall?
So I'm not talking about recall campaigns. I'm talking about a dimension of how does the consumer purchase your product. So I would agree that cars are definitely a recall style product. But I'm not sure. I just wanted to draw the distinction. I'm not talking about car recalls. That's just a procedural thing. So I'm going to take May as being cars, right?
Is recognition obviously like it's like the customers will obviously recognize the logo, so they'll know. Like Paul, I know you spoke about recall to McDonald's, but you just see the M and you know it's McDonald's. So it's familiarity of logos.
That's right.
Yeah,
so
like
give me a product, Monica.
Let's do, I was going to just go, well, it's a car, Mercedes.
Okay, so I mean, I think that actually that's going to be a recall type of product.
Okay.
What about Heinz tomato sauce?
Heinz tomato sauce, yeah. Pepsi.
Heinz, great, happy with that. Sanjay?
Not that I use it, but Head and Shoulders shampoo, is that a recognition?
Cool. Right, yeah. All right, so let's just talk about these. I'm sorry?
Can I ask for the brand equity? Can it apply for surface brand like Tony and Guy?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, their product is like surface. It's kind of like the product, right?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would put, and this is, let's talk about that because that's a really nice problematic one. When I say problematic, it's one of those ones that kind of pushes the boundary of each. So, of course, everybody says that their stated requirement is that people remember their brand, but I assure you that having done that as a pure profession with large-scale budgets, it's very, very challenging to be in a top-of-mind recall position. Very, very difficult. And the quantities you're going to spend are staggering. And so really the fundamental difference you're looking for is when I come to a category need moment. So Paul, I'm going to disagree a little with you on fast food. It's unlikely that you go, oh, I'm hungry, but not impossible. And then you'll drive 40 minutes for a McDonald's. It's quite likely you drive down the road and you go, hey, I'm feeling a bit hungry. There's McDonald's. Cool. Do I make a purchase decision now or not? So that recognition is strong. But of course, they spend absolutely huge amounts of money on making you remember their brand because it does differentiate them, allow them to charge product. And if you're sitting at home, you're not going to order Uber Eats from randomburgers.com. If that's going to be a thing, you might walk down to a McDonald's because it's available. So the technical marketing thing is that brand is available for you. So when you're searching, it's there. But fast food is right on the edge. Head and Shoulders, that sort of Heinz. You're walking down the aisles and those brands spend a lot of money so that simply as you're walking down, you see it, you go, hey, do I need tomato sauce? So the fact that the product is there triggers the check, the mental check about, do I need this? Whereas a car purchase tends to be quite a large considered decision and therefore brand recall is much more important. You're not in a shop walking down, oh my goodness, I need a car. It's a thing. I go and search, I search through my mind, what brands am I interested in? I then do research, etc., etc. So you're not looking for a trigger. Maybe the archetype of recognition is the sweets queue in front of a checkout. That's pure recognition, right? You walk down there, you see a chocolate, you buy it. You didn't think you needed a chocolate 10 minutes ago. You probably didn't need it then. But the fact that you see something, there's some sort of trigger, I like the brand, I buy. But you're not pushing people to say, please name 5 chocolates. It's, which is sort of more of a recall test. So Tony and Guy is, again, one of those categories, but like McDonald's, where you go, if you're walking through a shopping center, you see a hairdresser, the placement is really important, and that may trigger you to purchase the product, whether it's Tony or Guy or not. But when you get to a big brand like a McDonald's or a Tony and Guy, you may say, actually, I look for those. So, if you took 1,000 people, there's a small number who are recall producting, haircuts. Guys like Sanjay would probably walk into anybody who had a barber pole, right? I mean, that's...
I got one. How about Panadol?
Yeah, so again, you've got this idea of probably, if you walk into a pharmacy, you're going to go, great, I just want to recognize the name Panadol, because the kind of, the kind of use case is when you're in a pharmacy, you want to see a number of brands and you're going to pick one. So you're right that you can remember the name, like we're talking about these very big brands, but over-the-counter medicines typically are recognition. I'm just, I'm saying we can think of very big brands, but that kind of underplays the evidence, because sometimes, if you don't represent Panadol, but you have paracetamol, I'd suggest you're just aiming for recognition. Person walks in, they need Panadol. The pharmacist says, do you want Panadol? I've got something 50% of the price. You're like, yep, I'm happy. I would suggest over-the-counter is recognition in general. Right, the next thing is brand image. So I'm just stepping these out because these words kind of get thrown around. They sometimes can blend with each other, and you don't need an essay on each one, but they're just criteria. Okay, so you've got brand image, which is the associations. How strong are they? How favorable are they, and how unique are they? And those are the 3 dimensions of a brand image. So is Nike, is it strongly associated with Serena Williams? Are you quite happy with that? As well as their, let's say, their reasonable association or close association with the woke movement, and how unique is all of this in your mind? And so a big part, as you know, of the advertising campaigns is driving uniqueness and favorability and strength, but they're kind of slightly different dimensions. And so when you're thinking about a brand, just these 3 items are the 3 items. You can unpack it in a lot. And then the brand attitude is your brand image plus context. So I may have a brand image, and then my attitude can change depending on the context. Like McDonald's, my brand image may have some associations, favorable, unfavorable, unique or not. You put me in a context like it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I haven't gone home yet, and it becomes my brand attitude becomes far more favorable than 20 minutes before a gym class, where arguably those associations are quite differently weighted. Okay, so one of the things that I have asked specifically is the 4 C's of a brand position. And what I mean by brand position is the marketing product positioning statement, not physical location. And this is kind of like your brand promise. It doesn't need to be your brand promise, but it should be the thing that underpins all of your decisions. And you need to be clear what you're going to do. You need to be consistent that your promise is what you actually do. You need to be credible, and you need to be competitive. In other words, differentiated. Am I different enough? Am I good enough? And this is a sort of 4 C's marketing. Love the P's and the C's, and that's just part of the industry. But yeah, this is a neat model. And so when you think about a brand or fear or Saini, you really want to say, if I had a sentence, I would want to cover off these 4 C's or 2 sentences, so that I can really distill what I'm doing, because this avoids a lot of the messes that you see in product marketing. If you just have these 4 ideas in mind, am I clear? Am I consistent? In other words, if I'm going to advertise top end, my physical evidence needs to be top end. That's consistency. My service needs to be top end. If I'm going to, it's not, am I credible? In other words, do people believe I can deliver this? And yeah, am I different? That's kind of competitive message. And that brings us to the close of marketing. And you do have a course on this, but I think that if you just touch on these items, you'll have a good map to drive a marketing outcome from whoever actually does marketing for you, or at least to interrogate a marketing outcome. All right. Distribution. The main distribution systems are the retail concentration, channel length, channel exclusivity, and channel quality. So these are kind of 4 dimensions. And so, the difference between countries is retail concentration is sometimes very concentrated, and other countries it can be highly fragmented. So retail concentration in Japan tends to be very, very concentrated. In the United States, very, very fragmented. Channel length, obviously this is how many intermediaries are between the producer and the consumer. So direct sales tends to be short, but there are things, recognition goods. The chocolate bar has gone through a very long channel from the producer to a distributor to an importer and so on. Channel exclusivity, again, just a concept of if you allow a lot of things sold through the same channel or not. And then channel quality is really about, how specific is the channel for your product. So you've now got the 4 terms in mind, right? And we haven't spent a lot of time because I think you can kind of imagine what they mean: channel length, channel exclusivity, channel quality. And here's an example of how channel strategies, with the missing E, but channel strategy changes over time for an industry. It's important to recognize that it's key. So right at the beginning, Apple was sold through, very boutique for hobbyists and professionals. But then IBM, it became a direct sales thing through specialty stores, which is a little less exclusive than a boutique, and has a longer supply chain. You've got the IBM Compaq merger, and you now start having value-added resellers and superstores. And by the time nowadays, it's in electronic stores, you can buy them direct, you can get them from superstores, because the customer segment has become more and more and more broad. So a narrow customer segment will allow you to have a narrower distribution. And when you have very broad customer segments, you're going to have a very broad distribution. So, I think that this, I think this sort of makes sort of intuitive sense. And there's really 4 questions you can ask yourself. My customers, how important are the Ps? And my competitors, how have they solved this problem? So when we say that, what we're saying is, imagine if you're introducing a product to a new market and you need to decide on how do you introduce it? Are you selling it through all the stores or not? And some of you may have those products. If you're introducing food stuff, it looks very, very different to if you're trying to sell Sany product. Clearly, your distribution strategy is going to be completely different because your customers are going to be different and the competitors' behavior is different. And then obviously your channel, it's channel capability and cost. So who's going to hold inventory, process warranties, service my customers, and obviously who's got the power in the channel. So sometimes it's really useful to provide your product to an outsourced sales channel. But the key thing to note is that they can end up being the boss of that relationship. And so you've got this kind of high control channels versus sort of arm's length channels. So high control, means that you might own a big part of that sales channel. And effectively, your product is a high proportion of the final sales. So exclusivity as a dimension is high. Right? Length is probably low, but you have lower controls or arm's length where you typically are a lower proportion of the end product. So if you sell any sort of FMCG, you're going to be a low proportion of the final product. But you're also going to have low control. Now, does that matter? Well, it's very dependent on your brand size. So if you're McDonald's, you are big enough to insist on high control. You are entirely, but you pay the bills, so that works out for you. Whereas if you were a niche product, let's say the Incredible Meat Company, which is that a business in the United States that sells plant-based meat replacement products, there's just no way you're going to have your self-owned or a branded channel. You don't have the reach or anything like that. So you're going to be in this dimension. So it's quite important to figure out, can I actually pay for a high control system? Now, in a high control system, what you can do is you can manage physical evidence, you can manage your people, you can do all of that stuff because you own everything. And so this is why your super exclusive brands tend to have their own stores. It's high control. They have to charge a lot because their volumes are lower, but then they're able to manage their people and processes. And that's why that is a barrier to entry for them, because you simply can't set up a channel like that unless you're willing to spend a lot on it. All right, so we asked the question push versus pull, and here's some comments on what's called push versus pull. Now, this is, I suppose, a very neat, simple model for distribution channels and sales efforts, but it's not, it's not as nuanced as the other marketing questions. So, the argument here is that firms fundamentally choose between push and pull strategy. And as I said, it's somewhat a summation between, several different dimensions of selling, advertising, and distribution, but they're neat headings. So they obviously depend on quite a few things, from channel length, media availability, media consumption, the product type, the complexity. So push strategies are more common where you have industrial products or complex new products where your distribution channels are so short and where the availability of media, broadcast media to reach a large number of people is low. And pull strategies are more common in consumer goods where distribution channels are long and sufficient print and electronic media are available to carry the message. So, this is an insight into how much advertising and what style of advertising is going to be required. Because when you look at a product like Sunny and Putzmeister, you have a very different perspective of what they'll be doing than if you look at perhaps a product like Coca-Cola or beer. So we've got some examples coming in a second. So here's an idea of what Dell does. They've got a very short cycle. The procurement through to the manufacturing. And then detergent, as I said, FMCG tends to have this huge, huge sort of complexity, a lot of layers. And so that's called push. It's not simply the length of that channel, though, that defines whether or not you pull or push. The question is about how does the sale happen? And with that comes common patterns, but they're not necessarily purely exclusive. So we're actually going to do a breakout here, and we're going to spend just 5 minutes. If you could just decide push or pull for each one of these, and one sentence reasoning, and I'm going to break into 2 groups. Is that going to work? 2 groups, cool.
We lost Nicholas.
Oh, we can have a break now.
Oh, yours, Paul. Run the class, mate.
Oh, you mean he's not here?
Yay!
It's break time. Yay.
You won't
I was
leave
talking
us?
to myself and I was sitting here, geez, it's unusually quiet. Okay, cool. So how are we let's get some ideas. Soda vending machines.
Pull.
Oh,
Nah, I'd go push.
push.
All right, I'm going to go on the side of push here. I think the distribution strength is very important. And so the more places it's available, you kind of have a point of sale requirement. I'm thirsty, I see a soda vending machine, I get it. The consumer pull of this is, I would suggest, reasonably low for any given soda vending machine. I think so. I would argue, I'd support push on that. So Amazon.com.
Pull.
We went with pull as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree, right? I mean, you've got a number of choices on the internet. The consumer decides to go through pull. And what does that mean? It means that Amazon will spend a lot in making sure that you recall their brand, because when it comes to a moment that you want to buy something, you have a set in your mind and they've got to be on that list, otherwise you'll go somewhere else. Fully. Emergency care.
Who should we put?
Sorry?
Push in our team.
So we defined emergency care as, I guess, a very specific niche, as like using an ambulance. And I guess you don't want to have to know an ambulance exists to be able to use it. You should be able to just call and sort of know it exists and provide that service. So we went with pull for emergency care.
Yeah, it's an interesting example, isn't it? Emergency care. So, I think it's got those dimensions of going, well, perhaps the sales process here in non-United States is going to be, as you're saying, kind of a recognition, I have a need, and therefore I just want to, I have a very short list of things on my mind, but I'm not making a long thing. So I would tend to put emergency care in most countries under a more of a push type of recognition system, but I understand the challenge here. From a sales perspective, it is part of your recall list. It's not like necessarily in your face that I'm pushing a sale onto you. I suppose what this maybe highlights is if I said cardiac surgery, we would probably agree that's going to be, something like pull. You're going to have a lot of recall requirement in that. But probably emergency care, I'd suggest if, that has a short channel, that's going to be a push type of problem. All right, paint industry.
Push.
Yeah, probably a shortish channel. You're going to be somewhere you need paint. It's either on the shelf and you buy it or it's not. So it's unlikely to be very deeply considered. Runway capacity in an airport, just a crazy example, I suppose, to illustrate the point. And again, this is, kind of if it's there, it's there. You're probably going to be pushed there. Okay, but two maybe a little neater, nicer examples that aren't so weird. Cars.
Our team was debating on push and pull, depending on models really. Peggy, I think you had an opinion on this one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because based on the value of the car, and also for if for the high luxury car, actually they work with the dealership, so they need more salesperson to deliver how the cars functions. So we put it in push, but also if like Toyota, they do lots of advertisement to selling their car in a like a mass market, so will be pull. So we put it in between. Yeah.
Yep. So again, if we look at push or pull as when does, how does the customer order occur, the customer journey, which is a key sort of thing to consider in every product. I'd bias it towards the pull. I understand your point about push. Certainly, that's how we run the industry. But there's a lot of customer recall here. There's a lot of what brand do I want, and then I walk to the place and I kind of I get the product in that way. There are sub-dimensions of the industry that be much more push. So if I said cars, so maybe that's too broad. So personal cars, I would suggest is quite pull-oriented. If I said car rental, I would say it's push, because then the OEM visits the car rental and creates demand by saying, here's my product, here's an amazing deal, where they are quite insensitive to the brands. They might much less sensitive than consumers would be in your personal car choice. Beer?
Paul.
We actually had a bit of a transition thing going on. We thought from a FMCG perspective, it used to be very push, but now with the development of microbreweries, it's almost becoming a pull, and it's sort of changing the market a bit.
Yeah, so I think that one of the interesting things, and this is maybe the challenge, that's why I'm relating it back to other models, pull versus push is sometimes used. It's a neatish thing, but as you can see, it suffers from, it's too simplistic. The world is much more complicated than this. So one of the things you saw in those beer cases is the amount that advertising that occurs in the beer industry. And so if, that wouldn't occur if it was simply a point of sale product. But the reality is people get to bars or places that they consume their alcohol and they'll ask for mainly their beer, although that's not strict, if that's not available, something else. And so, the other thing is that as we saw with Grupo Modelo and SAB is a massive domination of distribution. So that was their game plan. They could shut out other brands by just not giving them shelf space. And so, I agree that you could argue beer compellingly for both. What I'm just pointing out here is that this model is kind of neatish, but can be too simplistic, probably not too useful at this level. But it's important to unpack, when does you've heard in every answer, well, how does the consumer make the decision? And what is the sales process that's going to get me there? How important is distribution channel? And those are the three dimensions that I think are critical to always consider when you're considering a product. And sometimes you can use a push or pull, sometimes it's obvious. And beer is probably a great example of not obvious, because you compete by dominating the distribution channel, not through particularly price. We never saw anyone compete really on price. And yet you advertise very, very, very heavily so that people recognize you and create that demand, you know. So that is our marketing and push versus pull. So pull, you know, these are things where you have high recall, where the customer makes a decision. Maybe pull would be characterized by higher involvement purchases tend to be some pull, but where you have distributed purchase decisions. On the other hand, push is, in FMCG terms, high recognition items, but also when you have direct sales, you would argue that that's push. So car rental cars is a push model where I don't rely on mass market media. What I'm doing is I send out a direct sales force to create a deal every time. Obviously, when you need to do massive distribution for pure recognition, that's a push, and also latent needs. So if I'm selling a complicated product that addresses a latent need, I'm unlikely to do it in mass media, and that's really going to knock me out of pull. You know, because I'm trying to address a problem that you don't think you have at the moment. That's the end of that. Okay. So there's some global advertising, the question about standardizing advertising globally. I think that by now we've seen a lot about the cage model, and nobody should be surprised when we say standardized advertising makes sense when there's significant economic advantages and you simply can't produce any advertising in the local country and your brand name is global. But it does not make sense when you have a big cultural difference, or obviously if you've got a regulatory difference which simply bans your adverts. But you know, advertising internationally is pretty tricky. You know, so getting a good advert that can work in many countries is very tough. And even global agencies tend to be, you know, they tend to have quite weak local performance. So this is a tricky decision, global advertising. And I'd say where you're not sure, it's probably better to just review the material, but let it be locally conceived, if not produced. Production quality in some markets is terrible. All right, so that's our kind of marketing channel selection discussion. So as we said, the key focus here is always think about the customer journey, understand how the 7 Ps fit into that customer journey. What do you need to focus on? Make sure that you have a guiding sentence or statement which covers those 4 Cs. Am I clear? Am I consistent? Am I competitive? You know, and then when you understand my product, am I a high involvement or low involvement, and am I transformational or informational? Craft your message to solve that so that you're consistent and you tell people this is actually, or you instruct your agencies, this is what I want to see in my adverts. Far too much advertising is done globally with kind of scant theoretical backing. So these models presented are you know, kind of have been tested. They're consistent, they work. It's not all just people sitting in a room coming up with crazy ideas. That's usually not too useful. Now we have some really interesting stuff on human resources, and this is going to be important for your ORFIA, again, your implementation question. I put at the end there, your board has decided you're going ahead, whatever you've argued, you know, there's no negative points, but you've got to say, okay, what am I doing with human resources? It's clearly a critical part of a service-based industry. So clearly a staffing policy is concerned with the selection of employees around both their skills and corporate culture. So you know, you've got skills and then corporate culture. And selection in a new country will determine a lot of your success. Skills can be very different. And also notice at a very senior level, new ventures are much more difficult than established businesses. The scope of challenges that are presented are much broader than maintenance phase. So some of you who've been in HR would be closer to this. Your book and the theory kind of talks about three models: an ethnocentric, which is effectively that you pick your own and you deploy everywhere; polycentric, where effectively your local subsidiary gets its own management; and geocentric, which is kind of this gold standard where you just put the best person in the world in the best place. So ethnocentric is attractive when you simply can't find people in a country, when it's important for your value that you have a unified corporate culture, when you're trying to transfer knowledge rapidly, when you have non-financial controls and know-how that are very important, when loyalty is critical to performance. But it leads to cultural myopia, it leads to low levels of autonomy, and it can lead to overly prescriptive and weak performance, even though the performance follows the rules, that the performance can be poor. So you could imagine that when Walmart sends across a whole cadre of Bentonville, graduates to run a German, supermarket, you get problems. Polycentric approach is very good at adaptation and localization, but you can have a big gap opening up. It's pretty durable and flexible, but you might end up with a business which is no longer something that's your core business. So the point we're making here is the higher number of expats that you send, the more ethnocentric the label is going to be, ethnocentric staffing. The higher the control over procedures, know-how transfer, loyalty, cultural similarity, the lower the localization of that subsidiary. That's not always good. I'm going to show you some data in a second about what works when. And so you've got this as a summary: ethnocentric, polycentric, and geocentric. And you'll get these slides so you can have a look at this table. All right, let's talk about expatriates. So many companies look for the balance by adjusting their staffing mix to include expatriates. So not just hiring from your local country and dispatching them, but taking one of your employees. You tend to find that expatriates have either high technical knowledge or high marketing knowledge. That's really who gets expated out. They have several different roles, and we're gonna go through that. And they effectively attempt to bring the intent stroke logic, if you recall Peter Drucker or Prahalad and Bettis. What do we do? How do we make money? That idea, the intent or logic from the parent into the subsidiary. So distance matters. The number of expatriates per country varies according to the domestic social capital. So how many qualified people are there domestically will drive how many expats you end up trying to utilize. So in United States multinationals, something like 60% of employees in Saudi Arabia are Americans, whereas in the European subsidiaries, maybe 1% are Americans. So clearly there's a huge cultural gap in Saudi, but the ability to hire domestic management is quite limited. Frankly, probably part of their resource curse, right? There's so much money that it's not. Is it worth it for us as Saudi to go through the grind of getting management experience? And Unilever obviously looks at trying to do a lot of localization, but it finds that the cultural glue that holds the company to parent actually weakens if you have only locals. And this is something that's pretty obvious. So the pattern is, and for good reason, is that initially you have quite a lot of expats in the setup stage, whether it's greenfield or acquisition. Then you'll tend to have lower as the operations stabilize. Then head office decides, oh my goodness, these people don't do things our way, whatever that means, send out more people. And then maybe 5 years down the track, you get some sort of stabilization at a lower number. So this is a typical pattern. Doesn't mean it's good, and I think you should, if you're running a subsidiary, or certainly if you're doing your case, make some recommendations about that using some of this insight. Expats, just note that they have a very high standard that they need to work to, because they kind of represent head office. And so the job of an expat is by necessity a cultural ambassador or head office ambassador. And, sometimes that's quite...
Nicholas, sorry, on the expats, because you see it quite a lot in pharmaceutical industry, especially upper management, and they rotate relatively quickly. Is there some sort of average turnaround time, or does that not really, is that not a thing? I don't know.
I don't think there's a thing, but they always do quite quickly. We're going to look at why expats fail and go home, just some stats. So it does tend to be reasonably short. I would suggest that 3 years is a normal expat lifespan. Certainly in the motor industry, across almost any brand, it's that sort of short. One of the interesting things is when you do it like that, when it's so short, it tends to promote highly aggressive autocratic management. So it's not necessarily an innate feature of the expat, it's an incentives problem. If I've got 3 years to achieve some ridiculous goal, right, which is usually what the deal is, go double share or something crazy. The only way I can ever do that is by autocratic management style, right? Because you just do not have time to build a culture, upskill people. You've got 2 years to kind of hit a number, and a year to polish your resume, and then you're heading back to head office. So 3 years, in my experience, is very, very common. And what it leads to is this kind of autocratic style. And there's papers that show that that's kind of why it happens. So we're going to just spend 5 minutes here in our groups. What are the roles of expats? So what I'm looking for is for you to come back and say, an expat has one of 3 different roles that you understand or you think you could deploy. So you're thinking about your case, arguably, the SANI or FIA. If you were to send expats, what is their job? One of 3 or 4. And I don't mean what their job level is, GM or not GM, but kind of fundamentally, why are you sending an expat? Because it's a key question you need to ask yourself. And if you're guiding these sorts of decisions, it's a key question to ask yourself. So what are the roles? I'm looking for 3 or 4 different roles, and then we'll see what the kind of models are of this. So again, this is just going to be 5 minutes in your 2 groups. Okay, excellent. So what are some of the roles we came up with?
Well, can we start first? Just brainstorming, Nicholas. Came up with the fact that if I'm HQ, I'm going to a local. So as a HQ personal expat, I will bring out my expertise, my technical skills.
Yep,
so
cool.
let's say,
Technical expert.
Yeah, and then the next one is to bring the culture exchange. And then again, we come up with the third one, which is networking, building the relationship for better collaboration for the future.
Okay, cool. Yeah, good. Sounds pretty good.
We had a similar one. So we talked about the same thing around transfer of knowledge and skill. We talked about the penetration of culture, understanding and aligning values. Then we talked about developing people, succession planning and building capacity in the subsidiary. And then we talked about quality control as well. And then the last thing we just talked about with Vicky was the role of kind of disruption in that space and how dangerous that might be in terms of barging in and trying to change things rather than working with local.
Yeah, as they do. Cool. So yeah, absolutely. So technical expert stroke, bringing those technical advice, culture, culture sort of boosters, and then we, plus networking, people development, succession, some quality control. All right, so we've got kind of 2 models, which I'll show you quickly. So one is obviously you've got this kind of head, the boss kind of role. 2 is a structure reproducer. So that is, along the lines of this cultural exchange. Then you've got the technical expert and troubleshooter, which might be quality control or people development. So when you have a disaster, there tends to be a specific role. And then some sort of operative, which fits somewhere in, I suppose, the middle between, maybe culture is a combination of 2 and 5. So sometimes you just need somebody to keep the organizational chart right, and other times a functional role is really about, doing or bringing the culture across, because typically functional roles could be done in country. So there are these kind of 5 classic areas. But there's another classification from Hartwig, which uses some animal metaphors. So the bear, this is separate, that's not a combined list, right? They're 2 competing, whichever one you find the most illustrated. So you've got the bear, which is the head office enforcer, right? This is, a tough job to have because nobody likes it, but they effectively make sure that head office decisions are applied. You've got the bumblebee, which is this kind of culture exchange person, which is about how do I get them closer to how we do things. This network, which May was talking about, Spider, which is just about creating this network, making sure that people are talking to head office. And so Hartwig has got, these 3. And the other model has 5. So yeah, fully agree. So there's a number of roles that you can use. More than happy with the descriptions we heard from the groups. You can use these, it's not wrong. But there are some roles that you might choose to send expats for. Expats are expensive. It's important that and they reduce sort of subsidiary autonomy. So it's important that you figure out what are you actually sending them for. So there's quite a wide variety of expat penetration and head office, international CEOs or foreign-born CEOs. So business programs in Harvard, Stanford, MIT in the US have high levels of foreign students, 20, something like 38, and that's despite the fact that they're in the world's largest economy. So, this is hugely competitive. But US corporations in general have a lot of executives from diverse backgrounds. So a lot of Coca-Cola CEOs, 5 of them have been foreign. Medtronic has a Bangladeshi CEO. Avon, I think the CEO may have just stepped down, but Chinese Canadian. 3M, has a Swedish CEO. Google currently has an Indian-born CEO. Microsoft currently has an Indian-born CEO. So this does differ, and it differs by country. Obviously, the United States tends to lead this. If you look at other large, important economies, you tend to have far fewer foreign-born CEOs. And this talks to questions that we dealt with, like meritocracy, social mobility, tightness of culture, and we said that the US tends to have a very loose culture, if you recall that lecture, and quite a strict meritocratic system in general. This is not clearly every single decision is made like this, but certainly the data says that this is the outcomes. All right, so here's some expatriate failure information. So US firms have quite high levels of expatriate failure compared with European or Japanese. So something like 10% more, even up to, so 10% is really common. 1 in 10 of the expatriates fail. It's expensive when they fail. Something like $40,000 to $1 million. These aren't just direct costs. These are relocation costs and direct and that. But also you get damage to subsidiaries. So you can imagine somebody who tries to enforce head office decisions and ends up with a shambles. This is a very expensive problem to fix. And failure rate increases with increasing difficulty, such as I'm moving into a very different cultural, so when my cage distance increases, your risks of failure do climb. So here's the kind of top 5 reasons for US multinationals. Expatriate spouse, not being able to adapt, the employee not being able to adjust, other family reasons, so children's schooling, security, etc. More the manager's personal emotional maturity and the fact that larger overseas responsibilities. This is a really key point, and what you'll see in a couple of slides is when you repatriate people who've done expat postings, there's a high level of attrition. And that really follows from this idea that it's sometimes from a head office perspective, they go, okay, I'm sending you to be a general manager of a unit in a foreign country. And it's the same as being a general manager in the home country. And I would say that the evidence is quite clear that it's not. The scope tends to be much more broad because you're solving problems of localization, adaptation. Whereas in the head office one, you're really sort of measured often on compliance. How well are you sticking to the script? And that different requirement pushes people very hard. And so sometimes a person who does very well in head office because everything is controlled and they are strict procedural type of successes, they get into expatriate organizations or positions, and they're now needing to localize and adapt and deal with things on the fly. And that can be very, very challenging. And the people who do succeed, you then bring them back and put them back in the bureaucracy, and they struggle with that. They go, hold on, I went out there, I made 100 decisions a day, it worked out, we made a lot of money. I come back here and I'm chastised for stepping out of the rule book. So a very common complaint, but this is what leads to that. That's that. When you expat people, they tend to, it tends to be a lot of work. You know, European firms, now you can infer what you want about Europeans and how they answered the surveys, but you know, it was really blamed on their spouse. And Japanese firms, the scope problem, a new environment, you know, lack of competence, and the spouse is actually the lowest of the problem. So you can see different cultures deal with this both in terms of their culture differently, in terms of how they report the problems, you know, that's different. And the problem of international responsibilities, perhaps, you know, the Japanese culture being very tight as it is, when those individuals are expats and are coping with a wide variety of novel situations, that might be fairly unusual. Okay, so although many of these reasons are about families coping, good selection does lead to better outcomes, clearly. And there's this model, I think it might be in the book, of Medenhall and Odo. There's 4 dimensions: self-orientation, others orientation, perceptual ability, and cultural toughness. I'm not sure how different this is from what makes good executives in general, but the point here is that the self-orientation and others orientation is a good degree of self-regulation and toughness. In other words, can you go somewhere and regulate and balance your behavior when you can see it's clearly not being effective? And what it excludes is those people who might be tolerated in some circumstances because they simply produce good results, but they rub everybody up the wrong way. That is almost guaranteed to not work in an expatriate situation where you know, they may not have all those tools. What are those 4 terms? Self-orientation, self-esteem, confidence, mental well-being. Others orientation is how effectively can I interact? Do I self-regulate? Do I pick up on signals? Perceptual ability is some sort of, you know, reasonable sensitivity, and toughness is just, can I manage the fact that the world is so very different? Matsushita, which is a large Japanese firm, you know, has a slightly different model. As I said, these are 2 competing ones. They're both fine. So they say, well, you know, do you have the technical skill? Do you have management ability? Do you have international flexibility? In other words, are you willing to learn and adapt? And language facility. And finally, you know, are you vigorous enough to go through this? So, you know, as you can see, this one is a lot less orientated around my, you know, personal attributes. Am I self-reflective, and am I a nice guy? And they're saying effectively, if you've got enough energy and international flexibility, adaptation, you're probably going to make it. I've just included this just to, you know, show you that it's always, and if any of you have experienced being an expat, it can really be quite quite all over there can be this curve of it feels terrible, then it's fantastic because it's novel, and you're taking your spouse to eat somewhere new and it's all culturally different. Then it gets interesting, then it gets very, very tough, and then it gets more sort of integrated and stabilizes out. So it certainly is a roller coaster. I think that you find some people that are professional expats, and it's not always a good thing that some people choose to do a career permanently posting to novel places. When it's inside the context of this is how you perform in this multinational, I would suggest that it means something very different when you're reviewing CVs, and I think you're in this industry, than when somebody migrates between countries simply so that they can stay expated in countries, which tends to lead to a very particular type of individual. And my experience is difficult to get results out of hiring those people. And that brings us on to this idea of the global mindset. Baham and Heimer said that really a global mindset is this idea of trying to be an intercultural mediator and change agent, cross-border coach and mediator. And really, this is about competing frames of reference. It's about shrinking that gap. Things like administrative difference can be quantified. You can send it to legal people. It tends to be reasonably easy to sort out. Economic differences, can be somewhat resolved. Geographic, again, administrative geographic tends to be quite, you can write them down and assess it, and committees can review it. So organizations tend to have processes to deal with that. But cultural and economic differences can be more sophisticated. And a global executive is somebody who's able to reframe those problems back in head office in the terms that head office can understand and wants to hear. So they go on to say that it's more than just a set of skills, it's a way of being, and it's balancing perspectives. When they're repatriated, it's important. Something like 40 to 60% will quit within 3 years, which is a huge number, and it's a very expensive problem. You just send somebody who spent time overseas, they potentially have done all this good work, you've got a lot of skills, and then half of them will leave you within 3 years. And they're often slotted back, as I said, to mid-level jobs, and they find that their scope went from high degree of autonomy and a lot of problem solving through to a much more regulated bureaucratic role, which is something that they may have left, but certainly not appreciated anymore. The scope is always broader because you're making novel decisions. And I'd suggest that the higher the cage distance, the broader and the more adaptable the manager will need to have been in order for that subsidiary to be successful. And it's just something to note when you're repatriating or advising on this, that balancing this problem is important. When you expat somebody, you end up with a lot of skills if they survive it. And trying to use that as best as possible is more valuable. The reality is a lot of them quit. So here's like the stats. Something like 60 or 2/3 don't know what position they all hold. They're vague about it, their career progression, or even they took what they feel was a lower level job. And so something like 15%, 1 in 6 will leave within 1 year, and 1 in 3, 1 in 2 will leave within 3 years, slightly different data sets, so quite high. One of the challenges is actually judging your expatriates. So if you use headquarters metrics, if you use Walmart metrics in Germany, you'll get a Walmart in Germany, right? Because that's what you're paying people to reproduce for you. They'll do it. And you just won't make any money out of it. And so sometimes head office metrics, although they're well refined and well accepted in head office, they represent, when we come back to the term, the dominant logic of the head office. And people will deliver on those incentives. And so it's important to kind of make sure that you've got a blend of approaches for evaluating. Home country managers tend to love their metrics because they're far away and that they feel that it's not under their grip. Whereas host country managers can be biased in their own frames of reference. And often the solution is to use a group of metrics so that it's clear what's expected, and some sort of other metrics that are more local country oriented, that can be a 360-degree performance appraisal, and those sorts of let's say strategic map outcomes as opposed to pure number outcomes. The reason you're doing this is just because you really want to judge if this person is working out for you before it's. All right, so we're right at the end of our slides here, so we just got, I think, 2 more. So technical knowledge is very important. Motivation is important, and adaptability is important. And then really, as we saw from the Matsushita model, this adaptability is, this ability to convert my head office frame of reference, and you saw that, that comment, into how do I translate between head office and the subsidiary culture. So motivation alone is an important measure. You can see that as described here. Motivation is a key driver to outcomes. So frankly, if somebody is motivated to succeed, it's probably going to work. Their technical knowledge, their adaptability, and their motivation creates this metric of their knowledge, or their applicable knowledge, and that is the second and very important outcome, and also drives the level of success of the subsidiary units. Why are you looking at this? Because it's important that you pick someone who's got technical skills, who is adaptable, and who is highly motivated to do the job. But how much is too much? I'm just going through this a little more quickly. We've got, maybe one of the key things is that technical knowledge tends to be more international and therefore will tolerate lower autonomy. Marketing knowledge tends to be local and therefore higher autonomy tends to work. And here's the kind of research output. And again, you've got the performance measure here. And you've got the cage kind of note up at the top. So that's coming next. So low expatriate ratio, if you've got low or high, it doesn't matter. But when you put expatriates and you have a high, when you've got a lot of expatriates and you start with high technical knowledge, you add value. If you don't have high technical knowledge, expatriates simply reduce autonomy. And we're going to see that in the next slide. So one of the key answers here is that expatriates should reflect the skills you're trying to deploy. So when you have high knowledge expatriates and high expatriates, you get high performance. And when you have high marketing knowledge and high numbers of expatriates, high marketing knowledge and low numbers of expatriates, you get better performance. And we would break out if we had enough time. But I'm just going to fast forward to discuss the why of this. So marketing, as we've said, is something that is very specific and mainly local. So if you have a lot of expats, what you tend to do is you get head office marketing, whereas locals will produce locally appropriate marketing. So that's product, pricing, promotion, all those decisions. So expatting people out in high numbers, even if you have high marketing knowledge, this is the high expat curve, does not lead to greater outcomes. So this is high expat curve here, and this is high expat curve. But when you have a lot of technical knowledge, expatting a lot of people out tends to work. The difference being most of the technical knowledge is internationalizable. Those people will go and solve problems for you in the local country. Whereas marketing, you don't get that scale like that. And this is our final slide. So in general, higher autonomy is better for subsidiaries in foreign countries. So what you've got here is this question of subsidiary autonomy and subsidiary performance. So this is autonomy, and this is performance. And so you can see when you have higher autonomy, in general, you have higher levels of performance, right? And when you have low institutional quality, your head office is more comfortable in giving high levels of autonomy to your subsidiary when they have a lot of expats out there. So, it feels like a bit of a tangle because, because we're doing this quite quickly. But let's just cover what we've said. When you have poor institutional quality, so you're not sure about the courts or the reliability of contracting or policing, your head office tends to give low autonomy to the subsidiary when there are low levels of expats. If you have great courts, autonomy and expat level is negatively related to the number of expats. In other words, if I send lots of head office people, of course, I'll get a low autonomous unit, right? But the reality is when you're not confident of the institutional quality, head office tends to want everything to be approved by head office unless they get a lot of expats. This is just a function of how businesses operate, right? And many of you would feel the same way. If you created a subsidiary in some developing market, you would want a lot of decisions to come back to head office because you're just unsure of how it's going to work out. The alternative is you expat people. My point is that higher levels of autonomy, clearly at the bottom here, whether, in any circumstance, higher levels of autonomy will lead you to typically better performance. So the expat decision is something that you should take seriously. You should only put expats in areas that they're really going to add a lot of value. You should figure out what their role is because it's a key decision. And, if you make it well, you really boost the ability of your head office to work with the subsidiary, its chance of success goes up. So don't ignore it and don't make it your last decision that you do at the end of, this is a key question.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating area, this, Nicholas. I just wanted to add, I know a few people will be as well, but I've had experience. I was brought in to work in Singapore by a local company who sought out my experience and expertise and brought it to the firm. And I think it's fascinating that line between what, like you say, what value you add and the experience you have, but also I work in a cultural venue, like we're an arts and culture venue, right? I work in education. So my ability to understand the local systems here very quickly and understand how the education works, how teaching culture works, as well as trying to then incrementally push certain agendas and kind of reform, it's kind of been the story of the last 4 years. So it's fascinating listening to this lecture and kind of thinking about how I've sat inside some of these systems and how I've had to understand some of these differences.
The real risk for let's imagine you were expated by a company, but if you went back home and somebody put you in, let's say, an appropriate, the kind of teaching role or that you had 4 years ago, you'd go, I've grown so much, this role hasn't changed. And you can imagine the kind of dissatisfaction that creeps in.
Totally. I think even just relating it to, I think because I technically brought a skill set that was lacking in the firm, I've been given a lot of autonomy by the leadership to kind of run it, go, a lot of, as you say, a lot of rope to run. I would imagine if I went back into a UK firm, I would be under a lot tighter guidance. Yeah.
Yep. And then, so what happens is you go, okay, that's enough for me. Thanks, guys, and leave. Yeah. So I think that as you make these decisions on behalf and for Orphea, these are key sort of thoughts to have. So remember the final question is, okay, you've got to make it work. What are you doing about that? One of the questions you should be asking is, okay, cool. Do I want to expat people? How many? What are they going to be responsible for doing? So, all right, we're going to break now for 10 minutes. Actually 9 minutes, and then we'll come back. And what we're going to do is I'm going to put those questions up anyway during the break, and we're then going to go into our 2 groups and spend probably 15 minutes, in breakout. Come back, answer the questions, and that'll be us. So I'll see you all in 9 minutes odd. Okay, so are we back? Do we have a minute left or something? Okay, cool. We're going to now break into groups for 15 minutes. As I said, we're going to make a group. We've got 2 groups, the split of the questions. So if you're in group 2, you're going to do question 1, 1A, 2, and 3. And if you're in group 1, you're going to do 4, 5, and 5A. So 1 is effectively the marketing end, and 4, 5, and 5A is this expat end. So 15 minutes, I hope, is reasonable for this. And then it's just about presenting that. Perhaps if you put it in PowerPoint, you can share a screen and go through your 3 questions. Right, I'm going to open the rooms, and in 15 minutes, let's come back. So, are you in a group? And recording. All righty. Group 2 or group 1? Which group's going first?
Yep.
I think our group can start first.
Cool.
I can share. Oh, shall I share what we've got as a few notes, and then Vicky can jump in, and the team, and Guillaume?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. Only very simple. There we go. Yep. So I think first and foremost, we put them. We decided we're chatting about them being collaborators, and we kind of was talking to them how they segment into different segments in terms of Sani being more low cost, to medium, looking at efficiency and standardization, and then was finding elements in the case where PM seemed to be more focused on elements of innovation and development and around customization. So we was having some discussions about the differences between those 2 areas.
Okay, because we only have, each group has done their part. So other group, can we get some comments or insights or questions about this?
I do see them as a competitor in some way, because I mean, the passage you mentioned that Sani has always wanted to buy PM, right? Although they're not listed in the exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course the one is on a cheaper price, one is on R&D. So I thought they have some element of competition as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So, Monica, it was you?
No, it's me. I think from the case study itself, Sani said they're always in love with PM. I guess Sani is always looking for a way or to go global or internationalize, right? Mm-hmm. So I will still insist like they're collaborator, because Sani is looking for a partner who can help them to go global.
Okay, so I mean, I agree. Like, I'm quite happy that they're a collaborator, but let's just have a look at 2 dimensions that you can use to do this. So the first dimension is what you referred to as the market. But you've actually touched on both. Just let's try organize it pretty well. So do we compete in the same market? So let's put compete and not compete. And what you've mentioned here is that Sani is effectively.
Nicholas, are you recording?
Oh yeah, you're
recording. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yep. So you've got competing and not competing markets, and I would tend to agree that we are, that Sani is not competing, not directly competing in the main with Putzmeister. Of course, there is a little bit of competition, but in the main, they're probably in the not compete segment. And then the next dimension is actually resource. So this is like resource-based theory. And you bring it up interestingly in your answer, although just that, as I said, we're just trying to organize. And you say here that Putzmeister is big on innovation. So I would agree with that. What is SANI's resource, do you think, or group of resources that it is bringing to the table?
You mean SANI?
Yeah.
SANI's resources?
Huh?
I think SANI's resources is a low cost labor, and then PM's case is R&D and then technology.
That's right. I think SANI's also got a good international footprint, probably a better international sales organization. And I think those would be reasonable things to put as resources. We don't know exactly how strong they are, but it does seem to be more broadly spread. So what we've got here is same and different, S being same and D being different. And so what we're saying is that their resources are pretty different. And again, and that's why I would tend to agree that this is where they sit. Their market competition is pretty limited, and their resource requirement is the overlap is pretty dissimilar. It's not exactly dissimilar. I mean, obviously, the SANI does say they do a lot of research, so I'm quite happy with that. But I agree with the overall perspective that in the main, they are more collaborators than competitors. And obviously, this zone over here is absolute competition. We have the same resources, we have the same markets, and that's just a pure competition.
But from the case study itself, in terms of resources like SANI, they are targeting on, even though they are low cost, but they are targeting quite a wide range of products.
Yeah.
But PM is more on a niche markets, mainly focusing on one or two, like pumping or like those equipment.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I agree that they don't compete in the main. So, like if we took their competition level, it's probably 20% of their products overlap and compete. And then that's why we've put them in the not compete column. And similarly, when you look at their resources, Putzmeister is really looking at very focused innovation for a couple of markets, whereas SANI has got a broader spread of product, and their resources probably more around that sales organization. Cool. All right, next.
So just to summarize, we pulled out the key brand promise for us around the quality will change the world, and I think the case talks quite a lot from both sides of SANI and PM around the importance of quality, albeit in different areas of the markets. So we looked at the 4 different C's. For us, we felt that clarity was there for both brands, very strong and distinct. Consistency, we were talking about particularly SANI being the biggest and highest standard, and also how PM aspires to do that, so that there's consistency across both brands in this area. Can they deliver credibility? I mean, PM is highlighted as Vicky was talking about the hidden champion, the great elephant, and again we know that SANI has that large network, and we know that they're reputable, highly reputable in that space.
And SANI in the Chinese market, compared to their competitors, it was being perceived as the highest standards as well. So it's credible.
Yeah. And then we had a good bit of a debate, I suppose, on competitiveness. We know that during acquisition that there's drop in revenue, and so we were kind of talking about whether the 4C has been impeded by, in terms of like a wait and see. We're not quite sure yet that this competitiveness is maintained through the acquisition. So that was kind of our final thoughts on that section.
Other groups comments on this?
But I have even though I was in this team, our team mentioned about, okay, the sales volume decreased after acquisition. But when we look at this competitiveness as a brand, I think my understanding is that what kind of like a power of a brand that this acquisition will bring in? That will be related to competitiveness. That
Sorry.
Is my understanding correct, or like do we have to look at?
So I'm, my comment would be that I think it's certainly in the case there's quite a lot of note about this idea that they'll remain separate and they have a single brand strategy in each country, and I think that it's difficult to kind of maybe merge the two. It'll be interesting to see how they market. But you can imagine now you've got a very big brand promise. You're saying we do everything, we've got quality. I think it's unlikely Putzmeister is going to compete in the Chinese market where you've got high levels of overcapacity. It just looks like such a big market, everybody wants to be in there. And you kind of go, okay. And so perhaps, you would argue that there might be the ability to put out a brand promise that kind of was, kind of tweaked in the market. So for the Chinese market, where Sany kind of is the dominant player, it might be German quality, as you've put here, German quality. I think the competitiveness question is more about competitive as a brand, differentiated as a brand, not so much as we're not trying to wrap the company question into that. Just is that a competitive place to be? So I'd argue that's just fine. But maybe in each country, you'd have to just be sensitive that you haven't over combined them. That maybe in some countries where you're Putzmeister, you have a brand.
From one of the exhibits of the case study, I found that majority of the companies, when they are choosing a company to acquire, like out of 10, 7 of them are choosing a Germany company. So I'm not really sure how competitive it is for acquisition with a Germany company, even though they are high standard, high quality.
Yeah, so I mean, this is just a brand question. Can you sell based on a promise of quality? And I'd say it's probably not. I mean, it's not inconsistent with the idea. I don't think there's enough German companies to flood the Chinese market. I mean, the market's just so big. All right, cool. Last question.
That's where we ran out of time. More time. So I suppose we only got to this very quickly in the dying seconds, but we looked at PM for pull factor around customer loyalty. And then on Sany, we were just discussing around the factors of pull. But yeah, feel free, team, to jump in on that.
Just some general comments then, open it up for everybody.
My thoughts on that one are, just looking at the case study at a cursory glance, it might be push, purely because I guess, as we mentioned before in this slide, that Sany's strength is that low-cost labor. And comparing it to other industries, I don't see an industry where low-cost labor has often been a pull sort of factor, if that makes any sense.
So I suppose I think that, again, this is just the question to stimulate the kind of discussion. We spoke about a couple of things. How does this consumer purchase happen? So you're quite right. When you have a customer who's loyal to a brand, they're going to order from the factory, when they need the product. So Putzmeister almost definitely has a stronger pull factor to that. However, when Putzmeister wants to convert new customers, they're very definitely going to have a direct sales strategy. In my mind, it's a complex product. It's a high-risk product. So if you're used to using a product that's 5% inferior, you still aren't likely to change just because you think there might be 5% out there. This is expensive equipment doing big jobs. Tends to be kind of very risk averse. This is decidedly a high involvement informational product. So I think it's going to have a lot of direct sales. So quite happy that you've got existing customers are going to be more pull for PM. New sales will be, I would suggest, a bit of push there because of how you're going to have to sell it. You're going to go out there, create custom deals, and Sany, depending on where they are in the market, could be, a very similar answer. You've got loyal customers potentially. The case does talk about this kind of very commoditized market in China, and so it may be a lot about direct sales. Or often, if you have very homogeneous, the case says very homogeneous market. So we don't really know, and that's why either answer is okay here. We don't know how good their brand is in terms of, those brand attributes. How strong is it? How unique is it, etc. in China? We just know that they're a big company, probably does an okay job, like in terms of the brand. All right, thank you. Let's go to the other group.
Because you only managed to complete one question.
Okay.
Okay, Sanjay?
Yeah, sure. So we'd gotten about.
We're gonna have a good class discussion there, right?
I reckon this probably falls into 5 alpha as well. Just
fair.
I'm gonna address both of them together. So we've gotten about, just as background to what we were doing, got about halfway through it until we realized that everything that we'd done actually didn't relate to the upsell model. So we had to then go back,
fair enough.
the upsell was, and go from there. So our understanding based off the case study, as we can sort of put it there so we can engage some discussion here, is that Sany has already achieved step 1. And if we looked at Germany as the case study and the focal point there, they've already achieved step 1 because I think, if I remember correctly, Cindy, feel free to jump in here, that they'd already established a network with a company there. So from our understanding, they'd already set up step 1 and they'd already made a commitment decision in that point. So therefore, the only other 2 remaining phases were then to effectively establish that foreign sales subsidiary and then drive further into that market commitment, to then drive that feedback loop to then move.
Yeah, so just to refresh everyone on the model, you've got this, the upseller model has got effectively 2 dimensions. The strict one has 1, but let's just what we put in the lecture. So here is complexity on this, and that means I go from export through to subsidiary, right? More and more complex. And at the bottom is more and more unrelated. So unrelated, positive. And so I think what we see, and your answer here is just perfect, is they started with sporadic exports to markets that were regional. They mentioned India, they mentioned Bangladesh. So you can imagine just on their periphery. So that is low complexity. It's exporting, right? You just sell your box and you move on. And it is to markets that are probably pretty similar to you. And then, the export continues to more and more dissimilar markets. So, there's some note that they do more of that. And then what they do is, they list, and, this is quite a big entity. And they set up a German greenfield site. So this is now high complexity and high there. So they probably, as you've said, they've got a foreign subsidiary market. So that's a little bit higher complexity. So that starts to happen. And the point we're making is that this is number 1, 2, 3, and getting to Germany, where they actually established a greenfield site, and they mentioned that they've got 90% local employees, et cetera, et cetera. And then now they're going for an acquisition, which is 1 step up, even more complex, because you're going to have to remember, we saw Fei Milk. Greenfield means effectively you can control almost everything about it. So we made the comment that often firms, they feel that they don't have a lot of internationalization experience, but a key technology might do a greenfield because they'll control all parts of it and figure it out as they go, and they don't have this big learning curve of integrating companies. And so that's why I would suggest that the acquisition is more complex at 5 than the greenfield. And I suppose what this is pointing out is that you have this kind of journey which is going along the lines of the upseller, increasing complexity over time. That was really the point of that. So yeah, quite happy with what you put. Cool. Next. Okay. Well, next. All right. So 5 and 5A. So let's just talk about expatriates and Sany. What are our thoughts about, what does the case say about expatriates? How many expatriates? So anybody, just say, how many expatriates would you put into Putzmeister if you bought it as Sany, up front, over time? And if you can remember those slides, because they were like 30 minutes ago now, like what would the job be?
Technology.
Yep, cool. Okay. So would you put lots, little, technical experts, I think is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. But also like culturally, they are different. So German culture and then Chinese culture. So I think kind of like the expats who can play a role of a cultural ambassador will be necessary.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on the kind of the job levels maybe, but it feels like putting too many expats out there doesn't seem like the strongest move. I think it's important that they understand the local labour market and that they understand those cultural differences that Ji Young's talking to. So I can't imagine it's going to be a high level of expats.
Well, I mean, so we don't know, right? So I suppose that's what we're just talking about. So what I've heard from Ji Young is it'd probably be some technical, and maybe so
cultural, like the ambassador, like PM is focusing on quality, and then Sani is focusing on efficiency. But
right,
at the
I'd
same
agree
time,
with that.
yeah, but on the other hand, local employees in Germany are quite happy that they were acquired by Sani, which means that German employees have autonomy from Sani as well.
Yes.
So I would not put so many expats in PM from Sani, but cultural integration is really key to make sure that this integration is successful.
Yep. So yeah, I agree. Some other comments?
If I remember the previous slides correctly, Nick, it was you wanted a high amount of technical experts and a low amount of marketing experts. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if you've got a subsidiary taking over their marketing with some foreign view, and here's a great example, right? Could you imagine a situation where Sani expats out the entire marketing department from China and believes that'll work? Like I go, it's, the great thing about business is you kind of go, no, that'll never work. And I'm not trying to tell you, I go, no, it would never work. So fully agree with that. So Ji Young's made a couple of points. We're going to work on this with you. So one is, I think that we all agree there'd be some technical exchange, and I would probably use the word exchange. I would suggest that if I was Sani, I would ask for several engineers from PM to be expatriated into my Sani operation, and they would be technically very good, and perhaps they'd be quite senior, because I'd really like some of those skills inside Sani, right? And the fastest way to do that, as Paul said from his personal experience, is you get somebody with those skills and you bring them over. And you're in that HR environment, you could imagine, I think that the knowledge transfer would be efficient, reasonably. And so I don't think you could take one lone PM person, pluck them in the middle of Sani and hope for the best, because it's a huge organization. Their market capitalization in 2006 was like $20 billion US. So there's kind of a minimum scale here, I think, to achieve an outcome. So there would be, I would suggest an exchange would be useful, and just pragmatically.
But from the case study, Sani did send a group of engineers to PM to learn from them and show respect, right?
Yeah.
And to innovate some like high quality product that they create together to bring that synergy on like at start. That's what mentioned
Absolutely.
in the case study.
And so that makes sense, right? I mean, you can kind of see the value of that. So if you expected a group of people, as Vicky's pointing out, they will learn from PM because they'll work in PM, let's say, for a year or 2 years, and you'll bring them all home and they will have been indoctrinated in many ways in the PM. So the key point we're making here is that we want to get knowledge out of PM into Sani in this technical quality environment. Also technical specifications, where the case makes note that Sani, the developed markets are extremely fiddly with their regulations. And so Sani needs that if they want to compete in many of these markets. They just got to get these specifications right. And they make note how many people they employed in Germany just to figure it out. So I think that an exchange would be a good term. I think there would be a number of people, for the reasons Vicky's just pointed out, because I want to bring back learning into SANI as the SANI person. I would still suggest bringing some PM people into SANI. But I'm not sure we're really trying to change PM's technical department. We're trying to share that knowledge in a way that's non-destructive, right? Maybe the next thing is just from our discussion
but what about that? Like in the case study itself, right? There are two very conflict. Not sure this is cultural directions or whatever. SANI is looking for aggressive expansion. PM is looking for stable. And also according to the Germany GDP growth or whatever. So when SANI is asking for 30% increment in a year, which is the whole management of PM doesn't think it's realistic, and that create conflicts as well. So this is cultural conflicts or direction conflicts, or what conflicts in the sense of like, what is that?
Yeah, so, it's a good point. So firstly, we were just talking technical. So I think the technical question could stand alone, and you would probably do that for the goals that we've just elaborated. Now you've got this different, so I just wanted to, let me just finish off the second point, which is, we also had a term called the spider role, right, from that one model, which is simply about creating communication channels between the two companies. And that's a good early stage, simply getting people to be able to talk to each other. So some SANI people moving to PM, simply to be able to improve, not to influence, but just to keep communication, cash flow budgeting, inventory management, that sort of thing. Just, who calls who, will definitely be useful over time. So now Vicky raises another point. Well, okay, now you've got a big divergence in sales forecasts. Is there a reasonable way of solving this? I mean, this is kind of an intractable problem. You'll find it occurs all the time, particularly when you have very high growth, aggressive companies like SANI, who are used to a Chinese market. Remember, SANI started in 1989, and by 2012 they're acquiring Putzmeister, which is a 100-something-year-old company. So SANI's experience of the world is that you produce a product and you double your sales. Putzmeister's experience of the world is we need to be taken over because we have no more cash because the developed markets are so sluggish. And so, Vicky, I'd imagine that the resource SANI brings to the table is this big network, a lot of knowledge of international markets, and perhaps some SANI people advising Putzmeister on international markets would be useful, right? Some like in the sales team type of area, where you go, okay, you think we can sell all this stuff? Bring people over here and we'll figure out what is our actual internationalization strategy. As we saw, PM thought they're going to go to China. I think that's highly unlikely. And in a postscript, it didn't happen for good reason. The Chinese market was homogenous, oversubscribed. PM going in there would have the wrong cost structure. It would be difficult. So yeah, I think that it probably SANI would expect some sales expertise.
Yeah,
so we would
actually,
call
I
that...
thought of SANI actually get PM. One of the objective is they're trying to penetrate the Europe market.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
whole Euro market, and then they can actually sell a higher price to their products.
Yeah, so what you could end up with is co-branding as a potential outcome, right? PM could quality assure your SANI product and then put a PM badge on it, right? This doesn't seem impossible to do. So long as you've got the R&D and regulations right, you could do that. So I agree with Vicky, it's a key thing to solve, and you solve that really by having some expat sales guys in there so that they're part of the team. And it requires that spider role really importantly, because you don't want to have head office being very frustrated. Oh, PM's not doing what we want. Where's the 30% growth? Just because the Chinese market has made the real expectations of SANI maybe unrealistic about what they could achieve. As the postscript says, they didn't get to 30% because it's not that PM was waiting on SANI. It's just that the market was particularly slow. So I think we all agree on a couple of other things. The bear role, which is this enforcer role, would be probably very damaging and not wanted by anybody, right? So it's important that you go, oh yeah, we don't want that, because that's a decision, and it would certainly strike me as reasonable. The culture, the B role would be, I think, onerous. It'll be a very long time before these two cultures merge. You're talking massive cultural gaps, expectation gaps. So probably start somewhere with just improved communication. And then the other model, we've said it's technical experts, both technical as in, I know how to design machines, but technical sales, like sales guy. And by that, we don't mean managers. We mean people who do the business. So maybe it could be a marketing technical expert, but we've just identified two groups that we think would be really useful. We also agree that you don't probably need supervisors in PM, right? PM exists, it works, it's doing its thing. So that's not likely. You might expat some other technical people in procurement because you may be able to share a lot of procurement knowledge here. Perhaps Sani is able to procure components more effectively. Certainly, I imagine they would do that quite early on in the piece. They have promised to not do too much, so they might not centralize procurement, but I certainly would suggest that expatriating some procurement specialists to see if you can lower PM's procurement costs would be valuable, and vice versa. So if Sani wants to sell into Europe, they're going to need some procurement from expertise from PM for some specialized process. So yeah, I think that's the kind of discussion that would be valuable. And when you talk in terms of numbers, Germany is clearly a high institutional quality market. And so we're really talking about transfers of knowledge. That's why we've only said procurement technical specialists, design technical specialists, sales technical specialists, not let's send over a swathe of managers or structural, organizational design people, which would be more appropriate if if it was the other way around. But you have two mature companies, and so a high degree of autonomy is, I think, completely appropriate here, and would probably be quite value destroying if Sani or PM tried to export lots of managers across the line. Autonomy would drop, performance would drop, it would be a mess. So I mean, I think it follows from intuition, from practical business sense, but those are the sort of guides. So that is it. These slides, we've kind of got some slides like Uppsala, etc., and the recording. So I'll post those up onto Curator, and that is us. That is us done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next,
It's been very interesting. So
other recordings have been posted, have they already?
Yeah, I'm going to check with Greg and just note that they were struggling with the downloads. So we'll just make sure that they're up and downloadable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yep. So any questions you have, obviously feel free to email. And
Nick, actually, I got a question about assessment 3.
Yes.
Because in the assessment 3 for the reasonable distribution of word count, for the number 4, it says 500 words per question or analysis.
Right.
So we got 6 questions, which is already 3,000 words. And for the second part, which is the executive summary, we need approximately 300 words, and introduction is about 500. So altogether, it is already over 3,500 words. So how could we do that?
I'm quite comfortable that I think you could easily do a great job in 3,500 words. So I'm not, there's no, it's sort of a guideline to say it's a substantial bit of thought that is expected. You do not need to hit 3,900 words, I don't think.
And the word count is also including the reference, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, to the extent that I don't think references, but yes, the table contents, because I imagine some of this will be tables and diagrams, so a reasonable estimate.
Okay, so not include the reference, because
I'm quite happy that it doesn't include references, but please don't, no, it's not going to be references, but I'm also not, if your document relies substantively on your annexures, then it should include the annexure word count. If the annexures are simply additional information, then it doesn't need to count. And what I'm saying there is, guys, I'm a practical person. I go, if your answer if I have to read the annexure in order to understand what you're writing, then it's got to be in your word count. Because I'm just trying to say, I don't want 30 pages of cut and paste from something. That's not the goal here. But if you provide 100 pages of annexure that you just say, hey, I found this interesting stuff, but you don't need to read it and my answer is still contained, then that's fine. But I would only provide, if I need to go to your annexure to get you the marks, then it needs to fit inside the word count, please.
So it means we
Okay.
don't need to exactly use 500 words to answer one question, right?
No, you can, those were guidelines and I'm more than happy you shuffle them as you see fit.
Oh, great.
Nicholas, I have another question. In your email attachment on the assignment question, there are 5, but in the unit guide, there are 6. The 6th one was prepare a market analysis, HR strategy, and supply chain matrix. It is not in your email 5 questions.
I think in the email I said that your board decides that you should proceed. Please provide recommendations.
Okay, so that is the 6th in that case. Okay, because it's just listed in the unit guide. It was not consistent. Okay, thank you.
So I'm quite happy that you follow the email guideline, if that works for everybody. And I'm sure many of you have a good amount of experience, so I believe I'll be able to understand your logic if you provide a reasonable report in whatever format you want to do it in.
No, if we are aligned with to follow your email guideline, then we will go for it.
Yep, that works for me. I think it covers very neatly what's in the course. So yeah, excellent. Thanks very much, and thank you for the time you spent here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, wait. Greg just wants to chat.
No. Just with William and Subhashini.
Okay, William and Subhashini. The rest of you, thanks very much. Have a great evening.
Okay.
So do we have the assessment as well?
Bye.
I'm sorry?
The assessing these course, this module. You're going to send out a link, right?
Okay.
Great.
Feedback survey, Leon, is that what you're talking about?
Survey, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Yep, absolutely. Thank you. See you later. Cheers.
Thanks, Nicholas. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Have a good evening. Bye.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Thank you. Cheers.